Hi, my name is Anke Bangma. I am curator of photography and contemporary art here at the Tropenmuseum, and it's my honor to give you a warm welcome at this evening debate that is part of the Collecting Geographies conference. The Tropenmuseum, as most of you will know, is a partner in this conference together with the Museum Folkwang, the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, the Moderna Museum in Stockholm, and of course the Stedelijk Museum, Bureau Amsterdam. Since this conference addresses, at least in part, the contested distinction between categories of art and culture, and therefore also of art museums and ethnographic museums, we considered it very suitable to have at least one of the debates here. This morning, James Clifford outlined why, for lack of a better term, the word globalization is still useful. He said, and I might misquote a little bit, but this is what I heard. He said, "It's productive as a signifier of an unrepresentable world of continuously evolving relationships, both distant and nearby." I hope that's not too far off the mark, because I was moved by this definition and a little worried by the addition of the term unrepresentable world. Because in our discussions about the future of the Tropenmuseum, what is at stake, despite its apparent near impossibility, is exactly this question of how to find new ways of representing, speaking to, tapping into, inhabiting this world of continuously evolving relationships, both distant and nearby. So it's therefore very topical for us to host this debate about what it might mean to think globally at this very venue. A little household remark is that you're very much invited after the debate to join us for drinks upstairs in the actual museum space, to have a look around and to look especially at the show that is opening tonight, a small joint presentation, Shifting Colors, very powerful, beautiful and thought-provoking, and a collaboration between the artist Iris Kensmil and Willem de Rooij. It's a contribution of these artists and a response to the thematic exhibition Black and White, which is also on view. So now, without further ado, it's my task to introduce the host and chair and moderator for this evening, Leon Wainwright. He's a lecturer in art history at the Open University in the UK and editor-in-chief of the Open Arts Journal. He is also principal investigator of sustainable art communities, a project that looks at creativity and policy in the transnational Caribbean. And it's in this role that we have already had the pleasure to see him in lively action as a chair and moderator in a conference at the Tropenmuseum before. Leon, the floor is yours.
The theme for our roundtable is thinking globally, museums, art and ethnography after the global turn. So very, very grand and actually perhaps rather unwieldy kind of theme. But anyway, the concept essentially was one outlined by myself together with Wayne Modest, who's sitting on the front row with his head in his hands, through lots of discussions that we've been having through the project that Anke mentioned, but certainly on the occasion of this conference, conversations about the promise as well as some of the, let's call them discontents that are suggested by contemporary patterns in public museums of various kinds, whether those museums are museums of art or ethnography or along a kind of spectrum between them in their changing focus on, quote unquote, the global. So, I mean, I raised a few questions that sit there on that page in your conference schedule. What does or would it mean for institutions of art and culture to, quote unquote, think globally? How can or has this global thinking affected the way that they program? And what impact have museums had or could they have after their global turn? I'm going to make a few remarks on this before we I invite speakers up to the stage and we get going. But I'm going to try and be very brief. The panel, I think this panel is in a very fortunate position. Those speakers are in a very fortunate position in the conference. At this stage, essentially, we're not saddled with the burden of introducing the theme that the panel had, in a sense, had to do last night. In other words, they to sort of explain the rationale, the basis for the meeting. Rather, I think what we can do is show that we're quite confident that the theme for the conference is already quite clear. And we can now sort of drill down to some of its detail and to wonder about its overall purpose. Or we could do, as James Clifford suggested to me earlier in the day, we could just sort of have fun, and hopefully let's try and sort of do both or all three. I've set out, as I said, some of the aspirations for this panel in the description in your program, and I'll probably refer to that as we go along, but more specifically than that, I want to suggest a kind of starting point of my own. In her keynote, Pamela M. Lee, it was only last night, it feels like a long time ago, she spoke about the changes that have taken place to a conventionally understood art world, and an art world that has gone beyond what Arthur Danto had once, in his conceptualization, called an art world with an atmosphere compounded of artistic theories. Instead, what we have, and I hope I am quoting Pamela Lee accurately here, is an art world which is, I quote, expanded beyond measure in a virtual babel of new languages, histories, and ideas beyond the art world's native borders. Well, this conference, the reason why I mention it is because this conference, and I suppose so many like it, especially by this stage, by day 2, can feel actually quite like a Tower of Babel, in my view. A place where so much talk of, the global contemporary, new geographies of museum collecting, and so on and so forth, has been circulating. A tower, I suppose, in other words, from which or within which no view can emerge onto itself, which is to invoke Pamela Lee's kind of conceptualization of that again. And I suppose that's why, as we heard in that first keynote, Pamela Lee would suggest forgetting the art world altogether. Or, as James Clifford suggested this morning, he sort of recommended that we might just want to kind of go not so fast, like just slow down and think again. Indeed, in James Clifford's own view onto this kind of babel of global movement in art and culture, what we have is something quite similar, I suppose, to that metaphor of the Tower of Babel. We have geographical connections and we have circulations of art works, of artifacts, of artists, of ideas, of people of all kinds, of information, of capital, and so on. Yet what we don't have is, or don't see much of, is a kind of resulting transformation. Or, as James Clifford suggested, we don't have much in the way of a translation. In other words, we don't have much that amounts to an experience of learning. We haven't really learned much. And we don't have much that amounts to an experience of listening rather than looking in an effort to understand the situations or the kind of conjuncture of situations that faces us today. Okay, so where do we go from there? Well, among the groups of stakeholders, if we can call them that we might start to listen to, and they are a group that's rather thin on the ground at this conference, are artists themselves. And they are, crucially, I think, an important set of stakeholders for any sort of broad-based endeavor to go about thinking globally. Why are they so often largely absent? It's a big question, I think, and it's bigger than one about who comes to conferences, for instance. And in a moment, we're going to hear from several artists. But one answer that I would suggest to that question about the missing stakeholders is that conferences such as these, which rehearse a kind of self-critique or a kind of reflexivity about their very purpose for existing, are largely geared towards the sort of producing of knowledge that privileges debate on culture rather than cultural practices themselves. And those two sorts of production, I think, can be located in social conditions that make the entire enterprise of representation possible, but they are not, however, treated equally. They're not really factored in, especially closely when museums in particular are thinking globally. And that's not the same as expecting art or artists or even cultural practitioners of diverse kinds to kind of solve so many of our intellectual and institutional problems, or even our social problems, for that matter, or our global inequalities, for instance. Indeed, perhaps too often have artists and artworks been burdened with that very responsibility, the responsibility of kind of taking critical positions. Very rarely have we asked such practitioners and cultural phenomena to tell us what is criticality, what is the place of criticality in the making of art, for instance, and art and culture, its cognitive uses, its social impact, its importance for audiences, for ancestors, for inheritors. And if at this point in the conference we've identified then that kind of thinking globally is a pathway for, one of many things. It could be about institutional opportunism. It could be a kind of mask for localism. It could be a kind of gagging order on those who are underserved, if we can put it that way, by all this globalizing rhetoric. Then what about kind of listening globally to those who live in and out of the worlds that we're describing? So thinking globally, listening globally, I'm going to in a moment start to hand over to our speakers. But let me first just run through the biographies of those speakers briefly. Jette Sandal, who will come and speak first, is the director of the Museum of Copenhagen in Denmark. She's a very exciting profile, someone who's very committed to individual and community empowerment, to creating public institutions, to dialogue, social change, and so on. In a sense, many of her kind of values, if you like, are implicit in what I've just been talking about. She has an enormous list of institutional achievements, not least being the founding director of the Museum of World Cultures in Sweden. And she's also been kind of all over the place, New Zealand, for instance, as well as Denmark. There's a very long list of publications as well that go with her profile. Wendelin van Oldenburg is an artist who many of you, I imagine here, will know, being based in Rotterdam. She explores all kinds of things in her work. Least of all is the kind of an investigation of the public sphere and of gesture in the public sphere. She works with public film shoots in particular, thinks about collaborating with various participants in and through the filmmaking process. She's also been very busy in the UK, I understand, and I know she's been at the showroom, Innova as well in London, and recently spoke at Train, the research centre at the University of the Arts London. Kader Attia, our second artist, if you like, has a fascinating biography of himself, having spent his childhood between France and Algeria. His work looks at the impact of Western cultural and political capitalism on the Middle East and North Africa, and with keywords, I suppose, that should include struggle, resistance, youth, and so on. He's exhibited extremely widely at major international exhibitions, and a very, very long list of those. Our two remaining panelists have already been introduced, and to this conference they'll already be familiar, but in any case need, I think, no introduction. So they are Professor Pamela M. Lee from Stanford University, an art historian whose work on late modernism and her historical focus on the 1960s and 70s is well known. I remember the first piece I read by Pamela was her piece on how George Kubler stole the time in the art of the 1960s in the journal Grey Room, which was a fascinating foundational text, which is widely published. And her book, Forgetting the Art World, I think is probably one of the more pertinent volumes for this conference. Finally, James Clifford, Professor Emeritus in the History of Consciousness at the Department of the University of California, Santa Cruz, again, absolute prolific and important speaker. I'm going to, in a moment, though, hand over to all of those speakers. But before we do so, let's hear first from Jette Sandal, who I'd like to invite now up to the stage. Please. Thank you.